It was a September. School had only started a few weeks earlier, and I was 15 years old. Hurting a bit jaded to the ways of life. I had been really angry at God, really only attending church for the community, plus normal teenage issues. The ministers had been discussing looking for the face of God in other people and ourselves, but I didn't really understand what that meant, or what that even looked like. That was the context in which I was attending Richmond Hill United Church's annual L'Arche service that year. L'Arche aims to provide a supportive and loving community for people with intellectual disabilities and their assistants. And they have communities all over the world, including one right here in Richmond Hill. I had enjoyed the entire service. The music was beautiful, even if I only very awkwardly followed the movements to the hymn, Peace Within You. I was inspired by the radical patience demonstrated during their candle-making demonstration, and I was inspired by the people sharing what they loved about the community. It was refreshing to see such uninhibited joy. But the moment that stuck with me in the service, even all these years later, was the performance by the L'Arche Spirit Movers. The Spirit Movers are a dance crew for people with intellectual disabilities and varying physical abilities, as well as their assistants. That day, about a dozen people came up to the front of the sanctuary to dance to a chant-based tune called You Are the Face of God. The lyrics said repeatedly, "You are the face of God. I hold you in my heart. You are a part of me. You are the face of God." I remember you could hear a pin drop in the sanctuary. My eyes were glued to a particular man and his assistant in the middle. He was using an electric wheelchair, but he was moving his arms to the beat with the biggest smile on his face. And the assistant was gently rotating his chair. And they both had expressions of pure joy on their faces. And it was evident how much they loved each other. And I remember turning to my mom and saying, "I get it now." In that moment, I had understood all that my ministers had been discussing. Upon further reflection, it was as if God was calling down to us all and using the words of the Gospel of Mark, saying, "These are my children, the beloved. Listen to them." In the story we heard today, told by the Gospel of Mark, Jesus chooses his closest companions, his most intimate confidants, to take a rather harrowing journey up the mountain. Anyone who has read about mountain climbing, or even climbed a wall, knows how difficult it can be. So obviously, the three people Jesus chose were very trusting of him, and were probably incredibly invested in his teachings. So eventually, the four people arrive on the mountain. And once they got there, Jesus' clothing was transfigured to a blazing white. And then it appears as though Moses and Elijah were there with Jesus. And they were terrified, so Peter, not knowing what to say, wanted to stay there in this euphoric moment. But the others knew this was not possible. And then suddenly, a booming voice, according to the story, spoke down, saying, "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Then, as fast as the moment began, the white glow disappeared. The moment was over. But everyone that was there was transformed. In the Bible study I led prior to this sermon, there was considerable discussion about how the Transfiguration occurred. There were many compelling theories, but what I believe occurred was, as Marcus Borg described in his book, The Heart of Christianity, what happened was that they experienced what he described as a thin place, which are moments where the barrier between God and us are blurred, where someone can feel God's presence. I would argue that the top of the mountain, for those 4 people, held a thin place, just as I had experienced with the Spirit movers. It was a moment that both Jesus and the disciples realized that Jesus was a child of God and the beloved. It affirmed for them that Jesus' teachings were correct. Now, I empathize with the disciples a lot in this story. I imagine the terror they felt in that moment when Jesus' clothes turned a blazing white, or when Moses and Elijah appeared. This serves us as a reminder that these moments of transformation can be very scary, that you can never go back to the way that things were before. But I also empathize with Peter, wanting to stay on that mountain forever, for wanting the euphoric moment to stay forever. Now, reading this story, I find myself wondering what this meant for the disciples, to find out that Jesus, their teacher, was a beloved. I wonder how this knowledge changed them. I imagine that it was empowering to know that they were following the right pathway. And I wonder if this moment gave the disciples the necessary courage to follow Jesus. As we recall from earlier passages in the Gospels, when the disciples joined Jesus, he told them that the life of the disciple was hard and difficult, that it was not the life of ease. I wonder if this transformation was part of the catalyst for their devotion. Was this transfiguration needed for them to join Jesus in working to change an oppressive regime? A question that is worth us wrestling with, that was brought up in the Bible study, was, do we need a sensational moment in order to follow someone seeking to change the world? Or should we look for smaller moments to prove that they are beloved, so that we may listen to them and help change the world? Realizing that the members of L'Arche Daybreak were beloved children changed me. Slowly, I noticed that I strove to be more patient, more compassionate with people who do not act like me. But most significantly, I realized that all people with disabilities are beloved children of God, that those who do not look or act like me are beloved children of God. And this was a catalyst for a passion for social justice, led to me attending a university where I felt that justice and diversity were passioned, to seek mentorship within the Regina Anti-Poverty Ministry, and to work at March of Dimes Canada, where I was privileged to be a part of a coalition to strengthen the Accessible Canada Act, which finally passed in 2019. I also wonder what this moment meant to Jesus, to realize that he was beloved. When Jesus was transfigured, he did not stay on the mountain, holding on to the euphoric moment, as many would have been tempted. Instead, he went down the mountain, back to the crowds, to an imperfect world in need of change. And later on, in a part of the passage we did not hear, he went to heal a child. Knowing that he was beloved, he chose to give to others, to devote himself to the betterment of our world. I find myself wondering if Jesus thought about the Transfiguration during the Holy Week narrative, from the euphoria of the crowds all the way to his betrayal, arrest, and crucifixion. I wonder if it gave him courage to face the crowds, to overturn the tables when he felt forsaken, arrested, and crucified. To apply this to us, I look to the book, The Ministry with the Forgotten, by Dr. Kenneth Carter, And he argues that we have an implicit theology, which develops over the course of our lives and is based on the beliefs that we develop. The most important force, he argues, that shapes an implicit theology is seeing love acted out in the world, to be loved and to show love. So, believing you are a beloved child of God can shape your implicit theology, which influences the way in which you see the world and how you love others in the world. Sometimes the process of coming to this realization that you are a beloved child of God to lead to transformation comes in the midst of suffering. And an anonymous phone call with the host of the podcast, Beautiful Stories from Anonymous People, Chris Gethard, a woman describes her daughter's journey with childhood illness. The little girl needed considerable surgery, and when she was recovering, she received an outpouring of love from her family, friends, nurses, doctors, staff, and strangers. So one day, while her daughter was recovering, the caller looked over to the girl's whiteboard in the room, and it had been filled with loving messages from everybody, including strangers. And in the middle of this whiteboard, the little girl wrote in 6-year-old handwriting, "Love is everywhere." And while nobody pretends that this is the kind of journey you want, the mother and daughter were transformed and able to find moments of joy because they are loved. They received moments of unexpected kindness from strangers, and they sought to pass that on to others, including collaborating with nonprofits to improve medical care for children, to improve research into the disease that the daughter had. So working beyond themselves, trying to keep her daughter healthy, to also help other children. So I ask you, how would you be changed if you discovered that your annoying neighbor, a person struggling with addiction, the slow driver that you cannot pass, someone who doesn't look like you, the person who hurt you, or a person whose values you abhor, is also a child of God and the beloved? How would you treat them? Would you work to be changed by them? Would you seek to join in a communion with them? To be prepared to listen to them? I ask you, how would you live your life if you knew that you are a beloved child of God? What injustices would you address? How would you spend your days? How would you be changed? What would still be precious to you? Would you live your life boldly and without shame? I ask you, where do you need to look to be transformed today? Amen.